As an investor, it's important to understand the sorts of factors that will influence the volatility of shares you're looking at. If you're building a diversified portfolio, you don't necessarily want shares that all behave the same. So in this video, I want to have a look at one key factor that can influence the price risk associated with the share, and that is fixed costs, or rather the proportion that fixed costs make up of a firm's total costs. So, with no more ado, firms basically incur two types of cost. There are fixed costs of running the business. Now, examples would include staff salaries. You have to pay those normally, regardless of how many units of production or sales you make during a period. And then there are the variable costs. Think, for example, of part-time staff wages. These can be varied up or down according to production stroke sales, or maybe raw material costs to some extent can be flexed up or down. And what I'm going to suggest here is that some firms have a cost structure where fixed costs are a high proportion of their total costs, and that affects the relationship between top line sales and bottom line profits. Now, inevitably, the city likes to use a rather fancy term to describe this. It's known as operational gearing. Highly operationally geared firms, that's firms that carry a high proportion of fixed costs relative to total costs, tend to suffer quite sensitive profits when sales change. What do I mean by that? Let's take a look. Okay, very simple profit and loss account. All right, sales at the top, 500 million, variable costs just 50 million, fixed costs a whopping 400 million, total costs therefore 450 million, profit 50. So far, so what? Well, here's the point. Let's assume now sales for this reasonably highly operationally geared firm. Now, what do I mean by that? Look, fixed costs here are a massive proportion of total costs. Well, let's assume that sales go up by just 10%. So a decent increase, but not spectacular. So let's put sales up by 10% and take a look at what happens to those numbers in this simple example. Sales up 10%, so 550 million of sales. Variable costs. Now, what did I say about variable costs? They vary with sales. So let's, simple example, let's assume they move up by 10%. They step up with sales. So 55. Now, fixed costs by their nature tend to be fixed. Okay, if you were to massively expand production, they might step up, you might need an extra factory or so on, but let's assume here they are fixed. We can absorb the extra capacity within the equipment we've currently got, the plant we've currently got, and so on. So, I'm going to leave fixed costs at 400. That means my total costs are now 455. So, sales 550. Total costs 455, suddenly profit down the bottom 95. So what? Well, here's the killer thing. 10% increase in sales has generated 95 over 50 as a percentage, a 90% increase in bottom line profits. That's when operational gearing works in your favour. So that high proportion of fixed costs relative to total costs has basically driven a big increase in bottom line profit from a relatively modest increase in top line sales. So you might be thinking, great, my portfolio needs to be stuffed full of firms with high operational gearing. Not so fast, because it works in reverse. The downside is this: imagine, and the numbers this time are ready to go as it were, imagine sales have dropped by 10% from 500 million instead of rising. So I've put all the associated numbers in. That means variable costs down to 45 million, fixed costs still 400 million. Those are the costs we incur regardless of sales, remember. Total costs therefore 445, profit 450 minus 445, just 5 million. So this time a 10% decrease in sales has triggered a 90% fall in bottom line profits, and that's pretty dramatic. If that keeps up, we're going to be making losses soon. So in this situation, a highly operationally geared business has got to take rapid steps to do something to save the bottom line. What can they do? Well, it's probably going to come from here. Fixed costs, not easy to get rid of. What do? Move buildings, sell off some assets, fire staff, but fairly drastic short-term action may be required to solve the problem. Now you might be thinking, well, that's all very well, but you've made this a skewed example. That cost structure doesn't happen in real life, does it? Well, it does actually. I'm going to finish off just by saying there are sectors where you get a high degree of fixed costs relative to total costs. And here are just three: banks, airlines and hotels, mainly property and or staff costs. The effect of high operational gearing is super profits in good years. Relatively small increases in sales, even better, big ones, generate massive bottom line increases in profit. But one whiff of a downturn, and these firms have to be pretty nimble, reduce costs, or face the possibility of profits going through the floor. Net impact as an investor, highly operationally geared firms can sometimes be quite sensitive to changes in the business cycle. Right? So there you have it. Operational gearing, or the relationship between fixed costs and total costs, one consideration as an investor when trying to put together a diversified portfolio. You don't want all your eggs in the highly operationally geared stock basket.